Hey everyone, welcome back to our study of Acts as we continue the journeys of Paul as he moves in a very precarious way across the Mediterranean. And yet, as we're going to hear a lot more seafaring nautical terms in our reading for today, I also want you to hear the theme of salvation that plays its way through this story. That while Paul is traveling, while Paul and his companions are in danger, that God's hand is very much just as present in this part of the story as it has been in all of Paul's stops in proclaiming the gospel to people who are on land. So let's open with our prayer and we'll get started. Let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. And just a quick reminder before we get started to tune in this upcoming Sunday, October the 18th at 5 for our Zoom meeting. Again, if you can't join us, they'll have it recorded so where you can watch it on YouTube, but just an opportunity for me to kind of give you some final thought points for Acts and also to give you a chance to ask some questions or bring up any comments you would like to on some things that struck you from our very lengthy but very good study of Acts. So, chapter 27, verse 27 is where we start today as we will read through the end of the chapter. When the 14th night had come, we were drifting across the Sea of Adria. About midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took soundings and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took soundings again and found 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. When the sailors tried to escape from the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea on the pretext of putting out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and set it adrift. Just before daybreak, Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been in suspense and remaining without food, having eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will help you survive, for none of you will lose a hair from your heads." After he had said this, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then all of them were encouraged and took food for themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. After they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. In the morning, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned to run the ship ashore if they could. They cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. At the same time, they loosened the ropes that tied the steering oars. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the ship aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none might swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest to follow, some on planks and others on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. All right, so where we left off yesterday was the sailors, and there was this ominous statement in verse 20, "Neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest raged. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned." Hence that theme of salvation, a theme which is not all that prevalent in the book of Acts. It is prevalent in Paul's letters. We saw sanctification, one of Paul's themes that is a theme of salvation that came up a couple of days ago in our reading, but it's not Luke's focus so much. But it does become the focus of this nautical journey with all of these mariner terms, these sea time things that are out there. And you may have been on a boat before and may have experienced some of these. I have a little bit of knowledge from living on the Gulf Coast for 8 years, but I am by no means a sailor or an expert on the sea. And so a lot of these terms don't mean a whole lot to me, all the things that they're doing to try to get control of the boat, to try to get it to go where they want it to go. But what is important is that as these experienced sailors are trying to guide the boat where it needs to, it is God's hand through Paul that is guiding and saving the ship. So Paul had this vision from an angel in which he says, "My destiny to go to Rome will be fulfilled. Stay with me, and you will be safe." He just said we will have to run aground somewhere on some island, which he could not yet foresee. So let me just throw up the map here real quickly, just real quick, because he's not really going from place to place today. It's rather where we left off yesterday. They were sailing around the little island of Cauda there, just southwest of Crete. And that's where the wind was just kept pushing them and pushing them and pushing them out to sea. And we hear that they are adrift for 14 days. And just to jump ahead a little bit, you see on the map where they wind up is the island of Malta, which is this gorgeous place. Sarah and I actually have been there on our honeymoon. Gorgeous place, and amazing to walk on the place where Paul actually was shipwrecked at one point. But during that time, they were adrift and not knowing where they were going to land for those 14 days. And take the map off now. Just wanted you to see today's journey. We don't need to look at it for the whole time today, just so you have an idea of where they're traversing. So it says on the 14th night, this is 14 days from when they set out from the port off of Crete, the fair havens where they were trying to get to harbor, and they kept getting pushed away by the northeaster and the storm that popped up. They were drifting across the Adriatic Sea, so that eastern part of the sea of the Mediterranean that is near Italy. And they're drifting along, and then they suspect on the 14th day that they are nearing land. So they take soundings, dropping down, and they pick up 20 fathoms. Basically, multiply fathoms times 6. That's how many feet it is. So 120 feet, and then 90 feet for 15 fathoms. Then they started dropping anchors and praying for day to come, because that would be the worst thing to do, is hit land at night when you couldn't see where you were, what you were going to hit, or even jumping out of the boat if you did run aground, what you would be jumping out on when you got there. So they were just hoping that day would come before they would hit land. But during the middle of the night, there's a few sailors who go up on the bow with the pretext of putting anchors out from the bow, but who are really trying to lower the lifeboat into the sea. And Paul says to Julius the centurion, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." And here is that interplay of salvation again. The irony is, as you would think, on a ship that obviously, even by Paul's own words, is doomed to crash, you get off on a lifeboat, you would be saved. But one of the important themes running through this entire narrative, really through the entirety of Acts, is the idea that salvation is for all people. My salvation, your salvation are tied together. The struggle that Paul has experienced is that he has been trying so hard to win his own people, the Jews, over to understanding this call to salvation through Jesus Christ, and yet they stubbornly refuse to do it, and recognizes that he's made his best effort to save them through the word that's been given him, through the teaching that's been given him, through the Spirit that has empowered him to do this ministry. But now here on a boat in smack dab in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, he is telling these Gentiles, these pagans, that we're all in this together. Their salvation and our salvation tied up together. And as Luke would portray it, it is only because of Paul's presence and his faithfulness in the Lord and the Spirit that rests upon him. That is what is able to save all of these people. But do not discount the fact that when Paul gives this statement, it is out of this mindset that our salvation is tied intimately together in the knowledge of God, and that again, salvation is not just spiritual in this sense, but it is deeply tied into the physical side of it, the healings that Paul and the apostles before him and Jesus before them were ways of saying that God's salvation would be known through physical acts of salvation that would then lead people to find salvation in the spiritual sense of having their sins forgiven and a new hope instilled in their hearts and a joy that comes from above that nothing on earth could possibly provide. Physical and spiritual go together. And as such, everybody's welfare is tied together. When you're on a ship, no doubt. And so, fortunately, Julius, who has taken a liking to Paul, says, okay, so the soldiers cut away the ropes of the lifeboat and set it adrift. So then we move on to verse 33, which is just before daybreak, which is right before they wind up running aground. Paul says to them, we've been 2 weeks at sea, drifting. We haven't eaten because we're rationing our supplies. We don't know what's going to happen. Take some food. We're about to run aground, but it could simply be as a reminder of the promise that God's going to take care of us and that not one hair of your head you will not lose one hair from your head, which is a reminiscent of one of Jesus's things. Not a single hair of your head shall fall. And so Paul then urges them to eat, but it's not just a simple meal. In verse 35, after he had said this, he took bread, giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. That sound like? Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It sounds like Eucharist. Now, is it Eucharist in the sense that we celebrate it today? Of course not. Is it Eucharist even in the sense that the early Christians would celebrate it? Probably not, because while Paul has Aristarchus, his Macedonian friend, and likely Luke on this boat, most of the people on this boat are pagans and good Jewish practice. You don't eat with pagans, but even in early Christian church, you don't eat the Eucharist. You don't eat the Lord's Supper with people who have not espoused a belief in the Lord Jesus. So it's not a Eucharist in that traditional sense, but all the themes of the Eucharist are there. First of all, the word Eucharist means to be thankful, a great thanksgiving. After giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. It's not just a simple meal. And we have even talked about when we would have images of the disciples eating earlier in Acts, and it looked like it could have been Eucharist. A lot of times those are just references of breaking bread together, the idea of sharing fellowship with one another. But this is sharing fellowship with people who are trapped on this boat, who are all desperate to find salvation, physical form at least, of it in some way, shape, or form. So Paul gathers them all and they share this consecrated bread, which has been blessed by Paul. But again, it's not a Eucharist, but it is the spiritual salvation and the physical salvation come together again, because obviously bread is the primary symbol for our physical nourishment. We have to have food. One does not live by bread alone, but yet we do need bread to survive. And so the idea of this bread bringing them together in a common fellowship, even though they don't believe the same thing, bringing them together under a common purpose, and that is to find land, to find salvation in some way, are themes of the Eucharist. In fact, when Paul talks about the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, when he talks about the history of its institution in his first letter to the Corinthians, he talks about it and says this was the origins of it, but it is the bread in which we remember the Lord's death and resurrection, in which we bring to mind his salvation and sanctification for us. And we know through celebrating the Eucharist that it is in the physical symbol of Christ's death and resurrection, the physical giving of his body, that brings us that spiritual salvation, the spiritual giving of Christ's Spirit within us. Those themes are very much present here in this sharing of the bread on this boat. Yes, it is not a Eucharist. I repeat that again. It is not a Eucharist in the ritual sense, in the classical sense. But here is Paul through something which is a very strong symbolic ritual of Christianity, proclaiming the gospel, the good news of physical and spiritual salvation to a group of pagans with a few Jew and Christian companions mixed in on this voyage. And in verse 36, all of them were encouraged and took food for themselves. The word is their spirits were lifted up. So this is no just arbitrary, oh, they're just having a meal. And 276 persons on the ship. Pretty good little congregation there that is sharing this special meal here together. After they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. So in that sense, it truly was the Last Supper, because they're throwing the rest of the wheat over into the sea and entrusting that God's going to take care of them. So that in itself is a pretty powerful passage in recognizing God's ability to sustain them even without bread. In many ways, like Jesus being out in the wilderness tempted by the desert when the devil tells him to command these stones to become bread. Jesus says one does not live on bread alone, but the bread has nourished them. But the bread is not what keeps them alive. The bread is simply a sign of God's salvation and presence among them. And hence they toss the rest of it into the sea. In the morning they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a beach, and they planned to run the ship ashore. And we know that this is Malta, because it's going to be named in the next chapter. And here they go through varying little maritime descriptions of how they're going to have to get the boat ashore. And so again, these experienced sailors are doing the best they can. But on verse 41, despite their best efforts, they strike a reef or a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow was stuck, but the stern was getting smashed by the waves that were hitting it. So they're stuck, and they're having to swim from this sandbar over to the shore of the island, which back in this day, not a lot of people knew how to swim. Interesting thing when you think of the stories in the Gospels of Jesus and his disciples on the Lake of Galilee, you don't really see a whole lot of swimming. You see Peter jumps into the lake. He jumps in, I'm trying to remember Matthew's account of the story of Jesus walking on the water. And then he jumps in again in John's account when they see him on the lake after his resurrection. You don't really see a whole lot of other swimming. That's because likely most of the disciples did not know how to swim, which would have been consistent with practices of the ancient world. And so when you hear them talking about those who can swim need to jump overboard first and make for the land, the rest of you just need to find pieces of the ship and float across because they can't swim. So they strike this sandbar, and then there's this interesting thing that the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners. Well, that's kind of, wait a minute. We're all in this boat together. Here, in fact, we just share this common meal together, and here we are with Paul. But we know through previous episodes in Acts that when prisoners escape, soldiers who were assigned those prisoners know that a very serious fate awaits them if they let their prisoners escape. So it's the programming for the soldiers to say, we can't control the prisoners, therefore we have to kill them in order to keep them from escaping and then suffering whatever fate that was going to befall them. But without Paul's urging, Julius, the centurion, who was wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. So Julius obviously has found some sort of not only trust in Paul, but you could even argue that Julius has maybe even seen a little bit more in Paul than some of the previous Romans that have encountered Paul, although that's, again, speculation, but with a little bit of hint that Julius does seem to take Paul a little more seriously than some of the previous ones. But it is through the hand of Julius that Paul's salvation comes. Reminder that God could use all sorts of different people to carry out salvation. The fact that Paul wasn't killed by soldiers who were, quote unquote, carrying out their orders was a sign that, again, God was intervening on Paul's behalf through this Roman centurion who kept him alive. And so all of them either jump ship, swim, or float on pieces of plank and go and swim up to the land. So the ship is wrecked, but all of them are alive. All of them are on this beach, And while they don't know what's about to come next, salvation has been brought among them. And we're going to see tomorrow, as Paul begins to meet the locals on Malta, that once again, salvation becomes a theme that runs through the work of this. I hope you see this, because I will give you a warning. If you haven't already read to the end of Acts, you would hope, after all we've been through, it ends on this great drama. Paul stands in front of the emperor and proclaims all this. I'm going to just burst your bubble now. There's no mention in Acts of Paul going in front of the emperor. Instead, Paul goes in front of the synagogues in Rome once he arrives. Really, for Luke, he doesn't care what happens. It's just that Paul gets to Rome. That's what he cares about. But instead of this climactic moment of Paul facing down Emperor Nero, rather what we have, the climax, so to speak, is that salvation is now being proclaimed in the heart of the Gentile world. It was the center of the world from the perspective of nearly everybody in that day and time, but Rome was also considered for the Jews to be at the very end of the world. And so from Acts' perspective, Paul has started in the center of the world in Jerusalem with the apostles before him and Jesus before him, and now has proclaimed the good news out to the farthest reaches of the earth, part of which is Rome, which then has access to points even beyond Rome, as legend speculates that Paul, then after he went to Rome, then went to Spain after that. That's not in the text either. All that is to say, keep hearing this theme of salvation, which has not come up yet really significantly in Luke until these last couple of chapters, because it is that proclamation of hope and salvation which Paul is now bringing to these very far away and distant places, if not distant physically, also distant spiritually. Thank you for being with me. As always, please join me tomorrow. We will be on Acts chapter 28, verses 1 through 6. Till then, take care.